What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So there were a lot of cards that Blizzard ended up taking out of the game in the alpha and beta stages, and a lot of them were just really cool, super broken, or kind of just hilarious honestly. And so today we're going to be talking about some of the cooler ones and going over 8 cards that didn't make it into Hearthstone. So let's get started. First up, we have a card that you guys definitely know about because it kind of did actually make it into Hearthstone, just in a completely different form, because the card is Arcane Blast. And as you can see on the screen, the original version was a lot different, and at the time this card was actually like really powerful. And it is a very strong card because a 1-mana spell that can draw a card but also deal some damage, and something like Tempo Mage is going to be a really powerful effect because you care so much about just spell cast triggers in general, and the fact that this already deals a damage that you can target, and not to mention stuff like Sorcerer's Apprentice, Flame Waker, all sorts of combo effects, and just a variety of spell power minions as well that are gonna really bump up the power level of this card. Like, I mean, just compare it to Shiv, right? Like, it's just Shiv but for 1 mana. So there's a lot of 1 mana slots competing for Tempo Mage, but this version of Arcane Blast, if it did actually get printed, it definitely would have found its way into the deck. And the 1 mana mage spell is something that could just dominate the early game and just control the board so well as letting the Tempo Mage deck keep up in cards. And overall, it's a pretty good decision that it didn't make it into the game, because this card probably just would have been super broken. Up next, we have a card called Envenom. So back when this card was around, Rogue's Hero Power would still let you increase your dagger's attack through hero powering. So at the time, the Rogue Hero Power was it would give you the 1/2 weapon, or if you already had a weapon, it would give your existing weapon +1 attack. So the thing is that players could just sit there buffing their dagger over and over again, and then eventually just OTK the opponent using Envenom. And this is likely why Envenom was just removed from the game completely. But since Rogue's Hero Power also got nerfed, maybe this card would be a little bit more balanced today. And it probably actually would be. Blade Flurry got heavily nerfed, Tinker's Sharpsword Oil isn't legal in Standard anymore, and there's definitely some cool stuff you could still do with this card. But in the current version of Standard, it would probably just be like a better warrior card, I guess. Maybe it would be good, but maybe it might not actually be as powerful. But that being said, it's pretty easy to see how overpowered Envenom could be with just a lot of the cards that have synergies with weapons, or honestly even just the Rogue Hero Power. And it's great for players that it got taken out of the game, since this kind of card would limit the design space a lot with rogue weapons especially, and just weapon synergy cards in general. And it's really good that Blizzard doesn't have to worry about that with their design. Moving on, up next we have a card called Mana Spring Totem, and this is a card that was almost certainly removed from the game due to balance issues, and it's not hard to see why, just because of the combos that it enables. And so for 4 mana, Mana Spring Totem makes all your cards cost 1 less, and this might seem a little bit weird on the surface because it does cost 4 mana in the first place, but it's really just such a powerful combo piece, a great OTK enabler as well. Like, this card just enables combos like nothing else, and it wouldn't be too hard to imagine a deck that just cycles these, maybe uses some Faceless Manipulators or something, cycles through the deck, and then eventually just wins. And that's ignoring some of the super cheesy combos with this card. I mean, right off the bat, you got the combo of Knife Juggler plus Youthful Brewmaster, which if you get 2 Mana Spring Totems is just an OTK because you get infinite juggles. And at the same time, it's not only that, there's just so many combos that this card enables. There's so many ways that you can also make it a little bit more consistent with stuff like Faceless Manipulator. And this is a card that Blizzard most likely tested as a way to learn a lot about the design of the game. And this is pretty much why Mana Spring was removed, and it's also why cards like Emperor Thaurissan reduce the cost of cards at the end of the turn rather than just being a static effect, because in the testing of Mana Spring, they found that that type of effect was just completely busted, and we'll probably never see this kind of effect ever put back into the game. For our next card, we're looking at something called Mental Collapse, and this is a really cool card for quite a few reasons. First off, it is a potentially playable card that has the each card in your opponent's hand mechanic kind of thing, similar to Clockwork Giant almost. Second of all, this card could also slot pretty well into the aggro or burn priest deck, actually, that people have been kind of trying to play for a while. And the fact that it got removed shows that Blizzard wanted to move away a lot from that direction, honestly, even though they kind of later returned to bit with cards like Shadow Bomber, and this card might have also helped the Priest versus Handlock matchup back in the day when Handlock was a competitive deck, which historically was definitely one of the worst matchups in the game for Priest. And Mental Collapse is a really cool card, and punishing your opponent for having too much card advantage is a pretty interesting mechanic, I guess, especially with damage, and it's something that we see in a lot of other card games, but this card probably wouldn't see that much play today just because there's not enough support for the aggressive Priest archetype, and overall this card isn't really that playable in Control Priest, but it is a pretty interesting card nonetheless, and it's actually not that strong, so we could definitely see it being put back into the game in the future. Next up, we have a card called Puddle Jumper, and this card is just completely insane, and if it existed today, it would definitely make Murlocs just a top tier deck for sure. And not only does Puddle Jumper have aggressively costed stats with a 2/1 body for 1 mana, which is already pretty decent, which is especially important since Murlocs can kind of only be an aggressive deck outside of maybe Paladin, but the thing is that it also makes all of your Murlocs cheaper, which of course just leads to some truly insane turns, and if you consider the fact that Murlocs all buff each other, it just snowballs and goes off like crazy. And with Puddle Jumper in your Murloc decks, you can honestly just hard mulligan for this card, dump your whole hand onto the board right away. Before your opponent can cast area of effect spells, you buff up all your Murlocs, and you just go off and create a monster of a board. And a turn 1 with coin with this deck could honestly look something like this. You know, you play Puddle Jumper for 1 mana, you play your second Puddle Jumper for free, you play a Bluegill for free, you coin a War Leader, you just play so many Murlocs and get such a huge board so fast, and there's no way most decks in the game could ever beat that, especially when you consider the fact that there's so many Murlocs that give other Murlocs health to where they could survive area of effect spells, and Puddle Jumper would definitely make Murlocs a better form of the Zoo deck than pretty much any Zoo deck that's ever existed, and it's not hard to see why this card got taken out at the end of the day, because it is simply just way too overpowered. Moving on, we have a card called Fade. So Fade is a pretty cool card because it's kind of the only card that we've seen so far that gives all of your minions taunt outside of the pre-nerf version of Sunfury Protector. But this version also draws a card, so it actually replaces itself, you know, kind of like Flare and a few other spell cards. And unfortunately, kind of like we've seen with another Priest card that costs 2 mana and draws a card, a minor effect stapled onto a 2 mana draw 1 card isn't actually that powerful at all. Certainly not powerful enough for constructed play, at least. It's just not fast enough. And sure, you know, giving all of your minions taunt is pretty cool, but if you already have a bunch of big minions on your board already, you're probably winning regardless whether or not they have taunt. You know, it's kind of like a win more card almost. And if your opponent is winning on board, giving your minions taunt at the cost of 2 mana isn't something that you want, because you really need to be spending your mana doing other things that would actually help you come back. And really the only use for this card would be if you cast it to taunt up a bunch of minions and then cast another minion without taunt that you really wanted to protect. But even that seems a little bit too far-fetched, a little bit too situational of a combo. Overall, you know, this card maybe has some potential, but unlike a lot of the other cards on this list, Fade was probably removed from the game for actually being too weak just in general, which isn't surprising since the card just isn't that great. So our next card is Greater Heal, and this card's pretty similar in design to Mental Collapse, except instead of damaging your opponent, it heals whatever you want for 2 health per card in your opponent's hand. Unfortunately though, this card is just quite bad, since the decks you want to actually heal your face for a lot kind of tend to just dump their hands really fast, and the control decks that have lots of cards don't really care whether you heal yourself or a minion for even like 1,000,000 damage, since they're usually winning through fatigue or through just late game threats anyway. And the only deck this card would maybe be good against is something like Miracle Rogue, or probably Freeze Mage, I guess, since they have a lot of cards in hand and they kind of do a lot of burst combos. But Greater Heal just seems way too weak in other matchups to be worth playing just for Freeze Mage type decks, and there's probably better options for healing anyway. And you know, an interesting mechanic to see on this type of card would maybe have been healing 2 health for each card in your hand, but that might have actually been a little bit too strong. But regardless, Greater Heal was probably just too weak for constructed in general, and Blizzard decided that it wasn't worth a slot in the classic set for Priest, and so they replaced this card with the 6 mana, deal 5 damage, heal for 5 damage. But you know, a different version of a heal that cares about cards in hand would actually be a pretty interesting way to do a heal effect that we could see in the future. Next up on our list, we have a card called Prayer of Fortitude, and this is a pretty interesting card because the thing is that its power level varies so much in between classes. In something like Priest, you know, it's probably not particularly good, but in a class like Shaman, Paladin, Hunter, Warlock maybe, that can just dump a lot of minions on the board really fast, this card could actually be incredibly powerful, especially in mirror matchups as well versus other decks like that. In Priest though, this card doesn't really do all that much though, and although people might try building some sort of Zoo Priest version, it ultimately just wasn't a relevant card in the Priest class specifically, and so it was removed from the game. And it's not a card we could see in Warlock, Hunter, or Shaman for lore reasons, but maybe it's something that could potentially make it into the Paladin class. You know, Prayer of Fortitude isn't necessarily the best card, but it could definitely work in a dedicated deck. Unfortunately though, the Priest class can't support those kinds of dedicated decks, and as a result, Prayer of Fortitude didn't make it into Hearthstone. So those are some of our favorite cards that didn't make it into Hearthstone. So what are your favorite cards among the group? Definitely let us know in the comments below. And looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.